Hello everyone, and I'm not sure if I'm supposed to start, but I think we'll just start now because it seems like it's time to start. So this is a panel discussion on Indigenous issues, Indigenous reporting, and all aspects of Indigenous journalism. So I'm Michael Dick. I'm the executive producer of CBC in Thunder Bay. I'm also a member of the Fort William First Nation and a proud Anishinaabe Ojibwe. And Thunder Bay is where I was born and raised, and I've now come home to be the executive producer in a time where it's, if anyone follows the news, it's a rather tumultuous time in terms of relations between First Nations and non-First Nations peoples, so it's an interesting job, but more on that later. I'm just here to moderate this panel discussion today, and beside me here are some of I can honestly tell you, some of the best and brightest in Indigenous journalism in the country. And what's really great about this panel discussion today is that we have coast to coast to middle coast. So
on the middle.
Basically, we've got a lot going on here. So we've got the far west, the far east, and some spectacular people. So I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves and discuss a little bit more about their career paths and who they are and what they do. So I'll turn it over to Maureen.
Okay. So just introduce myself?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Maureen Gugu, and I am Mi'kmaq. I'm Mi'kmaq from the Sipekne'katik Band in Nova Scotia, also known as Indian Brook First Nation. And I've been working in journalism for, this year marks my 30th year working in journalism.
Uklama Wamish Hupajazet Uhakwata Umiaksu Jesse Uhakwata Nu Wiksu Clifford. My name is Wamish. I am from the Hupajazet First Nation, which is in British Columbia's west coast of Vancouver Island, in a small town that's now called Port Alberni, but the portion that my people lived in forever was called Usmanus. I've worked as a journalist and photographer for the past 10 years. I received my first journalism education at Langara College in Vancouver, but the last year I graduated from UBC after taking a bit of a break with a graduate degree in journalism. That's me. Yeah. Sorry. I regress for just 1 second. Presently I work for Discourse Media in Vancouver, which devotes resources, time, and space for stories of reconciliation. Cheers, and thank you for coming.
Lenny Carpenter, Shenley Haswin. Hi everyone, my name is Lenny Carpenter. I'm a member of Attawapiskat First Nation, but I grew up in the James Bay community of Moosonee, which is right on the southern tip of the James Bay coast. Got into journalism after a co-op placement in high school, where I had a placement at the local daily newspaper, the Timmins Daily Press. I went to Algonquin College and I worked with Wawatee News, an Aboriginal newspaper that covers communities in Northern Ontario with particular focus on the Anishinaabe Aski Nation communities. I also had a brief internship at CBC Thunder Bay. And presently I am program manager with the Journalists for Human Rights, and I oversee the Indigenous Reporters Program. It's Jimmy Glitch.
Excellent. So as you see here, we have three exceptional people with very diverse backgrounds in Indigenous reporting and from different paths of life. Maybe Maureen, you can start and talk about your website and how that came to be.
Okay, sure. I guess I'll just give a little bit of a background. I think this is working. I'll just put it right here. Okay, just to give a little bit of background about myself. My first journalism job ever was working for 2 summers with the Micmac News as a reporter. Those were the summers of '87 and '88. I had just graduated from high school in '87. And basically what I did was I just drove around my home community of Indian Brook with my 10-speed bike and a recorder and a notebook and a camera, and I just went around interviewing people for news stories for the Micmac News, and I got hooked on journalism. And Micmac News at the time was the only Indigenous newspaper in Atlantic Canada that actually covered Indigenous news full time. So I guess, you know, I guess I have that desire to tell those stories from Indigenous communities. It's kind of grounded from that time when I worked at the Micmac News and the crew I worked there. And I guess my initial goal was, back then, was to go to university, go get a journalism degree, and then come back, work with the Micmac News, and eventually become its editor. That was my goal back then. What happened during that time was the Micmac News folded after the federal government yanked funding for all Indigenous newspapers across the country back in 1990. So, you know, midstream of me just getting my first degree, the paper just disappeared. And since then, there hasn't really been any independent Indigenous media covering those communities in Atlantic Canada. And that existed up until about 2 years ago when I started my own website, googleguest.com. Just to give a little bit of background of the name, I get a lot of this from people, and the reason why I chose the name is because it's just pride in my culture and in pride in who I am. Googleguest is how you pronounce it. You pronounce the K's as G's. In Mi'kmaq, Googleguest means owl, and you can see that the logo there, there's an owl there. And you look at my last name. My last name is Gugu. The proper pronunciation and the proper spelling of my last name in Mi'kmaq is Googleguest. So that's where that's what I keep talking about, pride in culture, pride in who I am. And that's why I decided to name my website after my last name. And I launched that about 2 years ago, but it was kind of I would say 8 years in the making. When I know I'm kind of going all over the place here, but you know, when I actually went to journalism school here at Ryerson. I went into the 2-year program and I graduated here in '94. And you know, I really didn't have much of all I knew is I wanted to tell Indigenous news stories. And my career for most of the '90s was pretty tough because you know, no matter where I worked, you know, it seemed like there was an interest in me telling Indigenous stories, but the interest would wane to a point. You know, I worked at the CBC, I worked at the Chronicle Herald newspaper, and it was just really tough, you know, and I felt really frustrated. The only time I really got to tell Indigenous stories from an Indigenous perspective for an Indigenous audience was the 6 years that I actually worked as the Halifax correspondent for APTN National News. I opened up the Halifax News Bureau, and I ran it for about 6.5 years. And, you know, I actually got to tell news stories on my own terms. I got to set, you know, I got to set the agenda. I wouldn't say set the agenda, but basically I set the tone. I got to pitch stories that I knew were important to an Indigenous audience. And I loved that time when I worked at APTN. But I guess after 6 years in 2006, I decided I wanted a break. I wanted to do something different. So I actually went to Columbia and got my master's in journalism from Columbia University in New York City. And while I was there, I actually studied they called it back then new media. It's digital media now, but I guess in 2006 it was actually still called new media. And I learned a lot of web skills, you know, because in my career I worked in print, I worked in radio, I worked in television, but I didn't really have online news skills, and I wanted to learn new skills while I was getting my master's. So it was actually while I was attending Columbia and in the new media program that I actually got the idea to launch my own news website, you know, kind of pick up where Micmac News had left off back in 1991. But like it was 8 years in the making. So 2 years ago, I started this. I launched the website, and I launched a crowdfunding campaign through Patreon. Last year, my husband and we decided to start selling ads on it. And the thing that I tell people about my website is that my approach is different than a mainstream approach to covering Indigenous news stories in Atlantic Canada. Getting back to the days of Micmac News and getting back to that time I worked at APTN, I write my news stories with an Indigenous audience in mind. I'm not trying to explain the way things are in Indigenous communities for a non-Indigenous audience. And I think that that's what sets me apart from other mainstream media outlets that cover the similar stories. I guess talking about, on this panel discussion, sort of the notes were, can you talk about the challenges and the opportunities? I started writing down the challenges, and the list became really long. And just to kind of give you a sense, I don't receive any government money for my website. None whatsoever. I generate the income through a crowdfunding campaign and through ad space. It's a very shoestring budget. My husband and I, we jump for joy when we're able to pay the monthly bills. And because of the limited budget we have, we're not always able to travel to First Nation communities outside of Nova Scotia on a regular basis. When we do, we really have to plan those out and make sure we come back with more than just one story. I guess, I've heard other people talk about how it's difficult to cover controversial stories in Indigenous communities. And I know it's happened to other Indigenous reporters, but for me, I've never been banned from a First Nation community or barred from contacting anyone within a particular Indigenous organization. I've never experienced that, and I'm not sure why, because I feel like I do cover tough stories. I know I do stories that are, that challenge Indigenous leadership, but I've also been doing this since I was 18, and I guess the Indigenous communities are all, like, everyone knows one another, and all the communities know each other. And I guess for me, they've always just known me as, oh, that's Maureen. Maureen's a reporter. They're just used to seeing me in a reporter, in a reporter's role. So I guess they're just used to that. And it also might be because of familiarity. But I do cover those tough stories. It's a challenge sometimes trying to cover regional or provincial chiefs meetings. Not all of them are open to the public. Sometimes it's at the discretion of the organization of whether they want to make that meeting public or they go in camera. It's an issue that I have challenged in the past. Like I've challenged the organizations and demanded that they explain why they're not making it public. And quite frankly, if you do look at and I tend to look back at the old archives of the Micmac News and how they covered stories. And they were very in your face when it came to a lot of these organizations, like with the Union of Nova Scotia Indians or with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. They were very much a constant presence for them. Sometimes, I don't know, like, I'm not sure if I would do the story, but I know Micmac News did the stories of when people just got fired from their jobs or quit their jobs. They used to do those types of reporting. Unless there was something serious to it, I'm not sure if I would report of all the changes in staff all the time. But in the end, like I said, sometimes you know, like Micmac News was always in their face. Micmac News always challenged, and, you know, and since 91, there hasn't been a news media outlet insisting on being at those meetings. You know, it's kind of like when that paper folded, that type of constant role of accountability just kind of went away. And a lot of Indigenous organizations and band councils just have gotten a bit too used to not having people challenge their decisions or challenge their authority. And it's something, for me, I would like to get back. I mean, I think Indigenous people, Indigenous citizens in the region deserve that kind of accountability in reporting, and I would like to get my website back to that. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge because of the money. It's a challenge because I don't have a budget to hire other reporters. I don't have a budget to hire freelancers. So it's just me, for the most part, covering these stories. It's just me and my husband. My husband is the photo editor, but he's also, you know, he's also the one that, you know, tries to sell ad space. He's also the one that also drives me to news stories. So, you know, it's just the two of us. What other challenges I have? I guess as a band member of Sebaganagadi, it's the second largest First Nation community in Nova Scotia. I am allowed, as a band member, I'm allowed to attend band council meetings. I'm allowed to ask for band council minutes and correspondence related to a particular issue. I have asked for these documents, and I've received them from band administration staff. And that's great, because not all First Nation councils are actually that open. However, I should point out that I cannot ask another First Nation community for the same thing, because I wouldn't be a band member. Instead, what I do is I tend to rely on sources from other communities to ask for that information on my behalf in order to get that. And sometimes I can get around it by filing an access to information request to the Federal Department of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. But in order to do something like that, I need to know exactly, I need to state exactly what I'm looking for from them in order for that to work, because once you put in that request, it would actually trigger, I wouldn't say trigger, but what would come back would be band council resolutions, and that's sort of what I would be looking for. I could ask for those from my own band, but I can't ask for those from other bands. I'd actually have to, like I said, work around it and get the band council resolutions that were sent to the Department of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. I guess there was a time in my career, and this mostly is in the 90s, when I used to whine that there was little coverage of Indigenous issues in mainstream media. But now that I'm in the business of covering Indigenous issues on a regular basis, I find that there's lots of issues and stories to be covered, and there's lots of events happening. And because I'm the only reporter covering these stories for my website, I can only write so many. So a lot of the stories that I want to pursue kind of fall by the wayside, you know, and I guess that's a good thing, but it just, you know, it really makes me wish for a budget. It really makes me wish that I had that money so that I can actually hire people and train them on how to cover Indigenous issues in the region, and to get more content up on my website. You know, and part of the challenge is also is that, you know, not every day can I actually spend my time working on a news story. I actually have to spend some time working on the admin of the website, whether it might be something technical or whether it might be helping, looking to drum up business so that we can raise money, so we can continue telling stories. Sometimes I have to take days out to do that. So for me, I guess those are the challenges of running my own website. But I guess in terms of opportunities, it gets back to that whole thing where I, because I'm the editor and I'm the owner, I get to decide which news stories I cover. I get to decide what I think is important story to be told. I also feel that since I started the website, my readers are beginning to have a sense of ownership with it. I'll give you an example. Last year I covered a very lengthy fraud trial. A non-Indigenous person was hired as the director of operations for the Siboney band for a 2-year period. During that time, he basically stole money from the band, and fraud charges were laid, and he pleaded not guilty. So last year, he had a 4-week trial. Again, I'm the only reporter. It's a 4-week trial, and I made the decision that I was going just to cover the trial. It meant I couldn't cover anything else. But during that time, I keep telling people this story, that when I would post a story on the website, my website would crash. People wanted to read that story, but then I would also start getting text messages and Facebook messages and Twitter direct messages from my readers asking me when can they expect to see the next story, because they really wanted to read what was happening in that courtroom. And it got to a point where I actually had to tell them, well, if you stop messaging me, I will have time to finish the story. But to me, that was really encouraging. It meant people were coming to my website, people were engaging, but they also felt like they had this sense of ownership that they can actually demand from me. We want this story, we want it now. And I really love that. I love that engagement I had. I have journalism students asking to intern with me so they can learn about covering Indigenous issues. I partnered with the University of King's College in Halifax last fall, where we had the digital journalism workshop students write profiles of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls from Atlantic Canada. So that helped me with content. I mean, there's over 30 murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls from the Atlantic region, and that can be really overwhelming to me. So it was really great that we had a group of students who wanted to learn about covering Indigenous issues. They wanted to know more about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and I gave them that opportunity to write profiles. And I guess for me, it comes back to what I was talking about earlier, is that I get to pick up in news coverage where the Micmac News left off in 1991. I see great potential with my website. And I guess the other opportunity is that I was approached last fall with CKDU. They wanted to put together a current affairs show about Indigenous issues. Well, when I go out and do interviews with people, I'm always collecting broadcast quality audio with my Zoom recorder. So I told them, I said, well, I have these interviews. Maybe if I put 3 together, that should create a half-hour show. So we decided to do that. So that's what I've been doing since last fall, is just taking those interviews, repurposing them, and putting together a radio show that airs on CKDU. And that is also recut for me so that I can actually post it as a podcast on my website and on other distribution channels like iTunes and Google Play. So, I consider GoogleQuest.com my baby. As long as my husband and I can pay the bills and keep pay rent and keep the lights on and keep the internet on, I'll always keep working on GoogleQuest.com. Okay, thank you.
That's great. I just want to point out that start thinking about some questions, because I do want to open the floor up after the presentations here, so that you have a chance to speak with each of them about some issues or questions you may have about Indigenous coverage or Indigenous reporting or best practices. So But we'll go to the other coast now, and Wamish, you can pick up where Maureen left off.
I was debating the last couple of days where and how to start this. And as someone told me this morning, there's no place to start but a story. So when I think back to when I started what started me in journalism were a couple of things. One was a memory I have from when I was 6. And when I was 6, I remember my father, my late father, reading a newspaper every day, particularly Saturdays and Sundays. He'd read them page to page, every article, just in silence in the dining room. And he would listen to CBC. He knew what was going on in the world. He knew what was going on in our part of the country. And with the local newspaper and local radio at home, he knew what was happening at home. He knew, and he took the time to know. Unfortunately, that's all I remember about my father, because he died shortly after that. Fast forward a bit to when I was 11. When I was 11, I used to come home and the newspaper would be delivered at 4:30 every day. The town had a daily then. And on the front cover of the paper this one day, it was a Monday, and there had been a function at a large hall near our home the previous weekend. It was like a costume party. And on the front cover of a paper was a picture of a non-Indigenous woman dressed in a Pocahontas suit with a pillow on her stomach simulating pregnancy, holding a green wine bottle, and had red marks polka dotted around her face. I remember thinking, you know, my people were decimated by disease and alcohol. My tribe was probably about 200 people then, and disease had decimated our numbers. And those of the sister nation that live in our valley called us the Shant people. And I never quite forgot that, and I remember my late mother being really consternated about it and hurt. There were so many things wrong with that picture, and so many things wrong with the reasons, the editorial reasons that allowed something like that to fly. All fast forward, like you wonder if things have gotten better today. Let me fast forward to just a few years ago. I was 4 or 5 years into my career as a journalist, working for a weekly community newspaper that was also in a town that had a daily. And the daily had just been sold as part of a group sale to another media outfit. And their new publisher had come down to address the staff. And one of the staff who I was friends with, and I'm still friends with today, gave me a call and said, Wamish, we've got to go for a coffee or a cold one. Got to unload. So we met at the end of the day, and she said, our publisher just told us that there are to be no more First Nation stories on the front page of the paper. You're a small part of the subscribership, and you're an even smaller part, non-existent part of the advertising base. And I remember how consternated that reporter was. Why? Because she cared. And I remember being angry, just really, really angry that something like that would happen. That ignorance I saw when I was 11 had morphed and now took the form of a suit, a decision-making suit. That is not to castigate all publishers and all editors, many of whom I've worked with that are not of that ilk. But that in this place, these two things happened. So back to when I was 6, that was the genesis, the beginning of my interest and career in journalism. I'd gone on to do a bachelor's degree at Vancouver Island University late in life. And In the first term of my third year, I had a credit hole to finish. My plan was to finish my degree in philosophy, go do a graduate degree in philosophy, and go back to university and teach philosophy. That was my plan. But in the first term of my third year, there was a credit hole to fill because the sociology course, research course I wanted to take was full. What was available was an introduction to journalism course, and I took it. And if you have children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews, or you have your best friend's kids, and they play with a kaleidoscope, I don't know if kids do that anymore. Do you guys know what a kaleidoscope is? You know how it's really blurry? They turn it and it's sharp and crystal clear. That's what taking journalism was to me. That's what it was. I devoured that course every day that I was at university, and philosophy was put by the wayside. So in 2006, I went to Langara College in Vancouver. I asked my journalism instructor, who'd been a former editor, you worked in a newsroom, where do your reporters get an education? How do reporters get to be reporters? And he said, well, here, most of our reporters have been in the Langara journalism program. There's a 2-year stream and a 1-year stream. 1-year stream is for people who are older or educated, to have life's experience. You might want to consider that. So I made an inquiry. One of my instructors from Langara, which I entered, was actually here today, Effie Klein. It was funny bumping into her in the lobby all these years later. But I left my family for a year and a half. I'm married, I have a wife and 5 children. But I left them to go and do this. There was no easy sacrifice to be made. If I brought them with me, I would never see them. The program was that demanding. And I started going home less and less because the work was just, it was demanding. But I was committed and I was dedicated and I wanted this and it was important to me. All the while, during that time, I never forgot that picture. But as I was defined, after being in journalism school and breaking into the business, I broke in with the Metro News, the daily, the commuter daily. And my editor is the now deputy editor, I believe, of Metro News here in Toronto, Fernando Canero, who used to encourage me to seek out and to find Indigenous stories. And from time to time I did with Metro, but I was given general news assignments to do. And that was actually a good thing, because writing about many different things and finding out about many different things eventually made me a better journalist when it came to Indigenous stories. So fast forward a few years, I've got a great experience at a community news daily on Vancouver Island, and I lucked out and was under the tutelage of a really good editor. She'd been in the business for 20 years, and she'd slowly climbed the ladder at different papers to eventually become an editor. And she'd won some community newspaper awards for her work, in addition to her photography. But moreover, she was a good teacher about journalism and about photography. That was my teacher for 8 years. And in the town, there were 2 First Nations, and there was a large First Nations population, and there was a tribal council that had different affairs. But she made it clear, and I never forgot this when we first talked, I know you're Indigenous, but I'm hiring you for your education and your skills as a journalist. You're a journalist who happens to be Indigenous. You'll bring perspective, and you'll bring understanding, and you'll bring awareness to stories about Indigenous issues, for instance, that I don't have. But again, I worked in a 1-person newsroom, and I covered many different kinds of stories across many different beats. And those made me, again, a better writer about Indigenous issues when I got to cover them, and I did get to cover them, when I could. In 2013, I did a contract with Journalism and Human Rights to cover projects that involved First Nations youth. And that was a turning point in my career, because my editor was a man named David Beers, who was editor of the Tyee, an online news publication in BC. but he was also a feature writing instructor at UBC. So on my way back from across the country, through Vancouver, back to my hometown, I'd stop in Vancouver and David and I would talk about journalism, about my goals in journalism, what I thought journalism was, how journalism was changing. And he asked if I'd ever consider doing a graduate degree in journalism because of the other opportunities that they may present to me outside of the community news world. And I never thought of that before. So he and I walked down to the Graduate School of Journalism at UBC. And if you're familiar with the little walkway down to the building, the first time David and I took that walk, some people believe me when I tell this story and some people don't, but I know what I believed. When I took that walk, I'd taken that walk before. It was all familiar and it fit. When I went into the building, it's like I was there before. I was already there. I got home. I already knew what I wanted. And the following year, those thoughts never left me. But one of the things that sealed my thinking to send an application to UBC was I used to keep a storyboard beside my desk, my old community news office, because I used to watch what went on in the world when it came to journalism, but in particular photojournalism. Photojournalism is how I saw the conflict in Iraq, the conflict in Syria, what was going on in different parts of Europe. And I used to keep pictures, not because I was enthralled with the violence in those pictures, but because some photojournalist did work that made me see that part of the world in that conflict. That's why I kept it there. But I remember my editor saying, your head is too far in there. You need it to be right here. And I felt like I finished grade 12 and didn't want to be in high school anymore. So the following year I applied to go to UBC, and I got in. I got my letter of acceptance in April. I left my job in June, packed up my house in the summer of 2014 and my family, and we moved to Vancouver in September of that year, and I was in classes at the Graduate School of Journalism at UBC. It gave me a professional break because I was on the verge of burnout. It afforded me to learn old things in a new way, and every day I parked what I knew at the door and left myself open to new learning opportunities and learning how to tell stories in new ways, including audio. That spring, I interned at CBC in Manitoba. Students were jockeying to come to Toronto, or they were jockeying to get into Vancouver. Nobody was paying any attention to these outlying news outlets, where there were longtime journalists in medium-sized outlets that knew the lay of the land, that knew the business, and that more so than any other place had 5 minutes for you if you were somebody green, beginning of the day or at the end of the day. But I had to do some learning on my own. My desk was right by the recycling bin. So at the end of every day, I'd stay for an hour and fish out scripts, greens. I saw how they were edited, and I saw how they were written, and that's how I taught myself how to write greens. I did that on my own. At CBC in Manitoba, I got to cover Indigenous issues for current affairs, but also for CBC Indigenous, which was then CBC Aboriginal, CBC Digital. Then I went back to UBC. And when I went, I got a fellowship from the CJF that summer, and I began work on my thesis, which I continued when I got back to UBC in September. And my thesis chronicled the banishment and reintegration of Indigenous sex offenders from their communities. And that seed planted when I covered the trials of Indigenous sex offenders in the community that I'd worked in as a reporter, because I used to cover courts. And I used to wonder, what happens to these guys? Where do they go? What happens when they finish serving their time? Do they even come back? Because I noticed a lot of them weren't coming back. So I did work on my thesis throughout the year and produced an academic portion, but also a professionally published portion, which is published through CBC Indigenous, 3 pieces. One about offenders who'd been banished and couldn't go home. One about an offender that had been banished, but was reintegrated back home. And then the 2 people who work with these types of offenders in the prison system. I thought it was an important thing to look into because there were so many. I thought it was an important thing to look into because of the manner in which they were being banned back at their homes. Councils were convening a meeting and passing a trespass bylaw with no representation for the accused, and people were banished. I thought that was an important thing to look into, to have a conversation about. But that also, some of these guys end up, when they finish their time, living in cities like Vancouver, where I met some, that have lived for 30 and 40 years after their offense, because they can't go home. They just go on to live quiet lives. Some reoffend and go back to jail, and that was a reality. When I graduated from UBC, I was approached by the Discourse Media owner, Aaron Miller. I didn't know too much about Discourse then, other than having met Aaron when she made a presentation at UBC. Because the other idea I had for my thesis didn't fly for a thesis. And that idea was to examine the issue of press freedoms and First Nations. When I graduated, I got a contract with Discourse to look into the issue of press freedoms and First Nations, which I did last summer and produced pieces. And I thought it was an important conversation to have. Much like with the series on Indigenous sex offenders, that was a conversation nobody was having, that nobody was looking into. And that's why somebody had to, somebody should. When I looked into the issue of press freedoms and First Nations, it was a really broad thing to look at first, but I narrowed it down and looked at BC's new treaty nations. Because they were no longer First Nations under the auspices of the Indian Act. They were self-governing First Nations that had constitutions, and I noticed in those constitutions they had adopted as part of them the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which contains press freedom. So as I was to find, there was a question about whether press freedom applied to First Nations or not before, but going forward now, in these places that have their own constitutions where they've adopted the Charter, it definitively applies. So I went to find out, since their treaty was adopted in 1998, how are they doing with this? And I was well received. I was the only reporter in their legislature when it convened. They don't have a domestic media. The local media, an hour and a half away, doesn't have the budget or the bodies or the time to devote to being able to send somebody to cover these things. And this was Canada's first modern day treaty with the Nisga'a people. That's the Nisga'a people who I examined. And as I was also to find as well, one of the other challenges that presented itself was that the people there, they were news consumers, they were media consumers. They listen to media, they look at media, they read media, they watch media on the internet, they hear it on the radio or online. But there's not a media culture. There's not a media culture, particularly when it comes to their legislature or their version of a public body, which has public officials, that make decisions that affect 8,000 people's lives. There was a guy that tried to get the Guguhues of where he's from off the ground, and he was well-meaning and well-intentioned. He didn't have the background, he didn't have the support, it was a struggle to make it go, and he didn't end up carrying it through. But he became an elected public official in his area, and now he lobbies for the issues that he used to see when he tried to be a journalist. So I looked into the issue of press freedoms because nobody else was, and it was a question that I'd heard quite often in other news outlets that I'd worked. Yeah, we have a band office, we have a First Nation close by, but we don't cover their affairs. Some projects I saw where I worked in the community I worked in had crossovers municipally or with federal bodies. You could cover the municipal body when they discussed it, and you could cover the federal body when they discussed it, like a port authority, for instance. But no one was going to cover the First Nations body when they and their people discussed it. And I thought it was an important conversation to have. The 2 times that I covered a difficult issue with local First Nations where I worked, I wasn't banned from those communities, but I was given a hard rap on the wrist for the issues that I covered, which was funny to me because when those leaders were elected, I remember telling them, from time to time, I'm going to have to come and see you. I'll cover your issues about kids, your accomplishments, your cultural issues, stuff about your elders, what they're doing. Yeah, that's part of news, and I understand that. But you have to understand this. You're involved with some difficult issues from time to time. But I'm going to have to come and ask questions about those. That's my job. That's me as a journalist. My indigeneity may afford certain access with these stories that wouldn't be available to a non-Indigenous reporter. But once through that door, I make it very clear, I'm a journalist. I have an obligation to ask questions about this issue. I can't make you answer. I can suggest that it's in your best interest to, but I have to ask nonetheless. That's my job. That's my obligation as a journalist. It's not just a job. So twice that it backfired on me, I got wrapped on the wrist. Told I had to go consult a communications person through the tribe, that they had to field questions first, come up with an answer that I might get emailed back to me and I might not, which is why I started going to other members to ask what their views and opinions were. So this hasn't been an easy business to get into, but it's a bit, there's not a day that I regret my decision to get into this kind of work. I'm not at the end yet, but there isn't a day that goes by that I don't love what I've done. Not every Indigenous story that I've pitched has flown. In some instances, I, as the journalist, should have done a better job crafting that pitch. And I have to take responsibility for that and wear it. And say so. But in some instances, I think those stories should have flown. Wasn't a hill to die on for me and leave my job. But in some instances, those stories should have flown. And it was an ignorance on the part of some editors, some, I will not castigate all editors, that didn't understand how those stories fit with siphoning it through new standards. A new standard. Indigenous stories are a new animal, a newer animal. They've been done, but there's more of a concentration on doing them now. And they're a new animal that they don't quite understand. I should say as well, ignorance to me is always an opportunity to teach and an opportunity to learn. And I think we're at the beginning stages of that. So that's who I am. That's why I got into this business. Those are the kind of stories that I've done. I tend to go where other people don't. Because if somebody doesn't, who will? To have those important conversations that need to be had. I make it clear that I'm a journalist who happens to be Aboriginal, but that I'm a journalist first with these types of things. It's got me in hot water sometimes. Every journalist has waded water in those hot waters. I'm not any different. And I don't regret having jumped in. And I'm glad I'm able to share my experiences as a journalist, my experience as a journalist who happens to be Aboriginal. Because I think we all, I can only speak for myself, but I hope my colleagues agree, both of whom I have great respect for, that we have an obligation to share what we know, because you can only be the beneficiaries of something that you may take out of here with you. Who knows, that might make an Indigenous story fly, that might make an Indigenous story better, but that you'll remember. I've taken up too much of your time.
Yeah, it was good. Don't worry. I just actually stopped. I forgot I was even moderating. I was just like, oh, go on. It's interesting.
That's good.
But you mentioned an interesting point of going where others don't go, and I think our our next panelist has a lot of insight on that, and I'll turn it over to Lenny Carpenter.
Yeah. Supposed to be playing a video. I can probably wait though.
Do you want the video now?
No, well, I guess I could just go into my little, we're all sharing a lot of personal stories, so let me share a few of mine. So when I started when I was just starting out in the summer of 2005, I was a summer student. I had just done in my first year of college. And I think in my second week, I got an assignment to go join a contingent of media and politicians. A particular note, the Ontario Premier at the time, Dalton McGuinty, to fly up to the Victor Diamond site, and they were gonna, near Attawapaskat, and they were to do the official opening, the thing they do with the shovel and all that. And then my editor, in preparing me for the assignment, he said, "Oh, well, this is an opportunity to ask about the Northern Table." And I was like, "What's the Northern Table?" And I was, like, growing up, I never really followed all the history and all the issues that were going on at the time related to Northern communities. And then, so I had really no background knowledge on what the Northern Table was, which I sort of learned that the Ontario government at the time was trying to work with First Nations leaders to form this formal table, discussions about resource revenue sharing and all that type of thing. But anyway, I didn't really know too much about that at the time. So my editor sent me a list of questions for me to ask the Premier. So I went up to the Victor Diamond site, and then I had my one-on-one with Dalton McGuinty, and then never interviewed anyone of that profile before at that time. Again, I was still, didn't even have my college diploma, and I was just a summer student. And so I asked him, so I started asking him the questions, and then he did his whole politician thing where they don't really answer. "Well, Lenny, we're going to work with the First Nations leaders, and we're going to do this and that," saying stuff without really saying anything. And I didn't have the knowledge or like the experience and the confidence to be able to like ask follow-up questions and all that. And then, so I just basically just wrote what he said in response to every question. And then I took it back to my editor, and I transcribed my notes, and I sent it to her, and she said, you took one for the team there, buddy." And then we ended up doing no story on it at all, just because he just didn't really say anything. So that was my baptism of fire, I guess, as it were, on becoming a journalist. And actually that summer too was the 100th year anniversary since the first signings of Treaty Number 9, of which about 49 communities in Northern Ontario were signatories. And again, I really had no background knowledge of this, but throughout that summer, there would be events at the communities that were signatories to the treaty. And I remember each time Anishinaabe Nation Grand Chief Stan Beardy, who was the Grand Chief at the time, he held office until 2012. But anyway, he always made it clear this is not a celebration of the treaty. This is a commemoration. We're not going to celebrate it because the federal government and the Ontario government aren't fulfilling the duties on their side of the agreement. And that really has struck with me and stuck with me all throughout the years that, yeah, and even as we go into this year, 150, Canada 150, and they say the celebration, and a lot of Indigenous people, including myself, don't want to celebrate it. We don't view it as a celebration. So, yeah, back then, 2005, 100 years, signing of Treaty Number 9, that was sort of my foray, as well as to learning about the history of that particular treaty, because my community, Attawapaskat, was a signatory to that treaty. But anyway, and throughout my journalism career, most of it was just reported with Wawate News. I mean, of course, we like to, you had to cover the hard news stories, deaths, suicides, and things like that. But my favorite stories were always the positive success stories. This season right now is one of my favorite because it's graduation season. And it's just, when you consider all the challenges that First Nations people in Northern Ontario and across the country have to overcome, the legacy of the residential schools, the underfunding of the education system, and all those issues, just all those we have to overcome just to even graduate high school. Like, it's such a success. And I like doing profiles of musicians who recorded an album, or a youth who led this health fundraising campaign and things like that. So those were always my favorite stories to cover, those profiles, feature stories. My mom's community, Fort Albany First Nation the high school basketball team made it to the provincials. That's one of my favorite stories that I ever covered, because they were from a remote flying community. They had little funds to compete, to play in such high competitions. Like, normally they just played against the boys basketball team because they couldn't get to a regular season game or whatever. But there they were, and they made it to the provincials, and they represented not only their community but their First Nations communities in general, and what they can achieve even with such limited resources. So those have always been my favorite types of stories, because the media has always betrayed us in these stereotypes. You got the issues with the misdemeanor murder of this woman, you got boil water advisories, we're protesters, we're angry and all this, but and throughout history, I'm reading a book right now called Seeing Red, and examines how Indigenous people were portrayed in media, starting with the Confederation of 1867, and basically just throughout history, just dehumanizing us, calling us savages, saying that, and the papers at the time just supported the whole expansion west and taking the lands from Indigenous people, and throughout the whole treaty process. And and just basically Indigenous people, we just never had a voice throughout all that time. And again, we're dehumanized, we're subhuman. And now in this, there's been a lot of improvement, obviously, in the last little while. And so that's partly why I enjoy doing those stories, because it's showing the positive, showing the humanity of us, that we're human too, we have feelings, and we have these successes that we want to celebrate. But anyway, so, and when I was, in 2012, I was at Wawate, and my colleague Joyce Hunter, she's a member of Weenus First Nation, and it's also known as Pewanik. They get polar bears up there in August. It's along the Hudson Bay coast. And she's a dear friend of mine. I mentioned when I had a co-op placement at Daily Press. She was a reporter there at the time, and that's how we met and became really good friends. But anyway, at the time, she had just come off working as a NAN communications officer, and she came back to Wawate, and this time she was a special projects officer. And she would tell me about some of the things she was working on, and I remember she was saying, I'm working on this thing with this organization called Journalists for Human Rights. And I was like, oh, what are they, and what are you working on? And she said, oh, they're gonna send journalists to community, and they're gonna train community members on journalism skills. So I thought, wow, really? That's really cool. And eventually, when I was still at Wawate, like, they did the pilot project in 2013. They sent a journalism trainer to a community to stay there for 3 months at a time. This was just a pilot project. It was 3 months at a time. They went 6 communities in total, and and we got a lot of those stories. There's communities like Attawapaskat, Moose Cree, Constance Lake, Kitchener-Magisiv, and Innuwug. What was the other one? Lac Seul First Nation, and Fort Severn, which is also along the Hudson Bay coast. Yeah, and I turned out to be pretty successful, and it led to what the current program we have now is the Indigenous Reporters Program. We're currently in the 3rd year of the program. I guess we have a video. Is there a video ready that we can play? But so this just summarizes some of the main pillars of the program, and then I can expound on it afterwards. So we can take a break from all the talking and watch this little. Watch this video. Yeah, so that was a video that we showed at our annual fundraising gala last October. But yeah, so we're currently in the last year of the program. In total, we worked in 10 First Nations communities, plus the 6 additional ones from our pilot project. We have content published mainly in our media partner on this project, Wawate News, which is part of Wawate Native Communications Society. We also had content published in other media outlets, the Ottawa Citizen, Out of Doors magazine. So with the scholarships and internships, some of them occurred in major media newsrooms. Of those 21 internships, 11 led to, or they ended up in full-time employment after the internship. And this is an era when, a lot of people are losing their jobs, including recently one was hired full-time by APTN, we just learned just the other day. Yeah, we present workshops to non-Indigenous newsrooms and journalism program classes. So far, 1,250 people have been part of those workshops. We've done those here in Toronto, Thunder Bay, some Ottawa, in places in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. The curriculum is currently being implemented by, right now, there's a summer course where it is taking place. I believe it's Trent University. And also I understand a couple of other post-secondary institutions are working to implement it right now. And also a recent thing we worked on is style guides for media outlets. The Toronto Star recently made some changes, and they had consulted me on some of those changes, on some notes such as Indigenous versus Aboriginal, capitalization, and a bunch of other points. And currently I'm trying to work with the Canadian Press on approving this section on what's currently called Aboriginal peoples and their style guide, which is taught in pretty much all, if not most, journalism programs, and is currently used as a basis for many media news organizations in their style guides. So yeah, so it's interesting that I'm in this role, like considering when I was at Wellington and hearing about the program, and to now being the manager of the program. It's been interesting, and I really believe in this work of the people within the communities being able to take part in this and just basically being able to tell their own stories. And yeah, at the local level, they developed some local media websites, and also developed some local radio programming. And we recently got funding to expand this program for another 3 years in Northern Ontario, and we're looking to expand it to other provinces as well. I think I touched on all the points, but yeah.
That was awesome. Okay, thank you. We have a few minutes left, and I'm told I have to get you out of here for your break. So we're going to turn it over for some questions. If you have any for the panelists, I'll ask you to keep your answers concise so we can get a few in before we have to leave. But if anyone has any questions, I'll play the Dr. Phil here and come out and just come say hi to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. I'll keep my question very short. This question is for Lenny, but for everyone really. What is the response you get from young people in the communities about becoming journalists? And also, like just generally, how can we get more young Indigenous people interested in journalism and pursuing it as a career? Because that seems to be a real key in a more positive representation, a more full representation of Indigenous people in the media.
Yeah, well, journalism is not really something that's presented as a career opportunity, and especially in remote communities or flying communities, just because, I mean, a lot of it is that, well, they don't have their own local media in any way of a formal way of keeping their community members informed on issues. And also, most of the career options that they ended up pursuing is related to the issues that affect their families and their community members. Like I see a lot of them end up taking careers in social work and healthcare because those are the big issues within these communities. So I like to think that this program is a way to present this as an option and what opportunities are out there and how basically how they can become a storyteller. Usually when our trainer arrives in the community, it takes a while to, first of all, they got to get acquainted for community members, but also just to build that rapport and let them know what are opportunities available and what they can do if they decide to take our media training.
I'd like to kind of answer that question too. I don't know, from my experience, we see a lot of universities come into First Nation communities out east doing career fairs, and a lot of the careers that they're actually promoting are mostly for the Faculty of Health Professions, law, but you don't really see universities coming in and promoting writing or journalism as a career, nor do we see in the curriculum, especially when you're targeting junior high students, because that's where you really need to plant the seed for young people to think about this as a career. You don't really see that kind of curriculum or some course that they're taking in junior high that gets them thinking about writing as a career. I don't think I don't think we're doing a good enough job in trying to promote that to young people. And out east, I constantly point out, there's universities who are promoting all of their, like I said, they're trying, the smart kids in First Nation communities, they're being led towards the sciences or health professions or law, but there's nothing there, or they're not promoting, writing as a career or reporting or doing something creative in that sense. And I think we could do a better job in trying to aim that type of programming to junior high students.
I think.
Can we hear from you about how it's going in Thunder Bay with the issues that you're involved in? Just put you on the spot there.
Okay. Well, yeah, as some of you know, I'm the executive producer of CBC in Thunder Bay, and when in 2015 when I got the job, I was the first Indigenous executive in all of CBC in 2015, which is hard to believe, but there are now more. So Thunder Bay is a very difficult period, and someone born and raised there, obviously the most difficult period I've ever seen of race relations between the police, the city, the people, and it's deeply divided the city. So every day in my job, it's difficult as I'm the chief person to assign people and then quality of the journalism, and I'm also a member of the community. I'm also a member of the Fort William First Nation, which is a community in the city, and my father is a former law enforcement officer with the city. So interesting dinner topics when we have dinner, but it's really challenging. It's a challenging situation to be in because you've got a lot of people who are looking to you for answers and looking to you to guide them through it all. So every day you have to be cognizant of the fact that your aim is to give the most balanced coverage you can, but also you're a member of the community. So it's been difficult. As you all know, Thunder Bay is now in the national media almost weekly, and it's all for all the wrong reasons that some might say. So the road ahead will definitely be a long and challenging one for anyone, Indigenous or non-Indigenous. And I can go on, but I want them to talk too. So.
My name is Rana Latif. I'm from the Ryerson School of Journalism. I have a couple of questions. I know it's a very sensitive topic, but as a journalist, and I'm going to be doing a presentation soon on this, I have to ask this question. Of course, we've been seeing back and forth conversations around the issue of cultural appropriation in writing, and I just want to hear your take on it. Each point of view, if you can just, tell us, your opinions. And the other question is, if we want to encourage all students, First Nations and non-First Nation students to write on Indigenous stories, how should we approach that? And what kind of advice could you give academics in terms of how could we approach it? And how could we encourage students to write in a well-informed manner, and that would be respectful to Indigenous communities?
Well, one of the best in the business, Duncan McHugh, has started a program here at Ryerson that addresses exactly your final question. But having said this, to academics, to people that are going to be assigning reporters to work on Indigenous news stories, I say just a few things, just a few short Coles Notes things. Show up. Do what you say you're going to do. And collaborate. Comes down to those three things, basically. And on the issue of cultural appropriation, I would say this. It seems to me, I don't know everything about this issue, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend to. But my read of it, my sense of it, it has really more literary implications than it does implications for journalism. That being said, it's a two-way street, to me, where I sit. On one hand, I would not want to discourage non-Indigenous journalists from going in to do Indigenous stories or into Indigenous communities to do Indigenous stories. Can you imagine if Jodie Porter in Thunder Bay took that tone and did not produce the award-winning work that she just produced on the subject that she did? If she said, no, look, I'm culturally appropriating, I shouldn't, I can't. The loss, not just of her work, her voice, but the loss of that work and what it made people think. And the second thing I would say is this. Yes, more room should be made for Indigenous voices, and more Indigenous voices should be encouraged to be heard in newsrooms. That being said, don't assume for a second that there is this macro, overarching, all-encompassing Indigenous view. We are many different peoples. My language, where I come from, my culture, my cultural codes, my customs, traditions, which make up my worldview, is very different from the Indigenous peoples who are from here. When I come here, I'm as much a stranger to them as somebody non-Indigenous would be. I have to think about that before, during, and after if I'm assigned a story to do about Indigenous people here. I'm as much of a stranger to them. I may have some understandings that maybe another reporter wouldn't, but really, I'm somebody different from somewhere different. That's what I would say.
Lenny, maybe sum up in about a minute.
Oh, okay. Well, with any non-Indigenous person looking to learn or interact with Indigenous people, and the main thing I always give advice in the workshops that I do is listen. And I think that's very, I'd like to differentiate it from hearing. Hearing is passive, listening is active, so you're actively trying to listen and trying to learn. And people come in there with their own agenda, like if you're a journalist, you're on assignment, and you're trying to look for the quotes, but and just try to, and maybe even try to fit the quotes that you hear into the context of your story. But really, you should just be listening and just be trying to learn. On the cultural appropriation, it's about taking space away from Indigenous people, like just on this whole topic, and with that one artist, like it's taking away space from Indigenous artists who, where the space should be made for them, especially when we're, historically, we've been marginalized and left out. And I also do not have a problem with non-Indigenous persons writing about Indigenous community, as long as they put in the proper time, labor, and respect, making sure that they have a strong relationship with the community, and giving back to the community as well in some way.
I guess when it comes to cultural appropriation, I mean, I certainly don't want to tell a writer, not to cover or not to write about an Indigenous culture. I mean, the only thing that I would hope and would ask is that they do their research and be very respectful when they're writing about that. That's what I would expect, and that's what I would want to see in their writing. As opposed to going into communities. I know you want it to be really short, but I actually have a story to tell. When I worked as the morning news editor up in CBC Cape Breton, one of the morning show hosts was kind of complaining about this residential school survivor who canceled on him for like 3 times in a row, and was getting really annoyed. And I'm in the story meeting, and I said, well, no wonder. This is what you're asking them. You're asking them to get up very early in the morning, travel from Eskasoni to Cape Breton, or to Sydney, Cape Breton, sit in a cold studio, bare their soul about what they experience at residential schools, and then say, thank you very much, move on to the next item, and this person has to deal with what you've opened up. I would cancel too. I actually suggested that he actually, after the show, pick up his recorder, drive down to Eskasoni, go to the person's home, sit down with the recorder, but have a cup of tea, have some Luskinigin with them, chat with them, and then get your recording and do the interview. I said, you'll probably get a way better interview, you'll get more material, and you'll be very respectful to that person, other than what he was asking earlier. It kind of made me angry that he was complaining and was being very, annoyed by this person canceling. But when I pointed out to him the perspective from that person's perspective of what they were asking, he actually thought about it and said, you're right. And he actually did get a better interview. So I guess that would be my advice to anybody going out into Indigenous communities or talking and interviewing Indigenous peoples. Think about what you're asking and be very respectful to them.
I have time for one more question. It has to be a real quick answer. Anyone?
One of the most interesting research projects I had a chance to do is Mr. Justice Linden asked me to look at press coverage, Main Street press coverage was called then, of Ipperwash, because he was writing his report and having his hearings. And it was eye-opening to me because it was so bad. And blatant stereotypes, like Lenny was talking about, appeared in the coverage again and again and again. One of the key points was were the Indigenous people occupying the park armed? And the police said they were, and shot first, of course. And they actually showed the reporters through the site. And only one reporter thought to ask, like, there are a lot of bullet holes in this bus, but what are they from? They said, oh, they look like all, the rifles we used or the guns we used. And she reported that, and nobody else reported it. Well, it turns out, after I submitted my report urging, pointing out all the bad coverage and looking at the sources reporters used, I happened to see a CBC documentary where there was a series of very powerful interviews with people who were there. And one in particular was an Indigenous woman who said, my people can shoot birds out of the sky. Don't you think if they were armed, they would have hit something? And it all brought back how the media let its biases lead it astray because it didn't report the truth of that. And it took years for that to come out. So my question to you is, could you name an Indigenous story that the mainstream media has got right?
And that person who comes up with the first answer has 30 seconds to answer it.
Mine, oh, sorry.
You literally have 30 seconds. Maybe none. Maybe that's the statement right there. Maybe that's the answer.
Whenever I talk about good coverage by mainstream media, by non-Indigenous reporter, we talked about her. Mentioned her a few times already, Jodie Porter, especially regarding the inquest into the student deaths. I think was really well done. That's what I always point to.
On that note, produced by CBC Thunder Bay, little plug there. We ran over time, so I failed you all as a moderator. I want to thank everyone who traveled in from all points of the country to be here and to speak so passionately about an important issue for all of us, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, and I admire you all for what you're doing, whether it's at the grassroots or whether it's in the communities or whether it's on the West Coast, the beautiful coast. So thank you all very much for coming, and I apologize that we were a couple minutes late. I'm sorry, but it was worth it, trust me.